talking about is events and how we can make interactivity into our actual program. Here's sort of a basic end product that we're going to have by the end of the lesson. It just looks like a random triangle, but what I've added in is the ability for it to get it to move, to steer, and to get it to actually go and move around the actual screen. So I have a lot of that, but then on top of that I've added in lasers. So this is kind of like a asteroid arcade game where you're able to move around the screen and get it to work the way that you want. So we're going to be looking at how we can get it to work with key events. That means the keyboard, mouse events, which is the mouse pad or any kind of a mouse type of device. We're also going to be exploring this idea of polling, what it means to be constantly looking to see if something's happened, versus interrupts, which cause everything to completely stop, resolve the event that has just happened, and then going back to the regular running code. So we're going to be looking at a couple things in today's class, and this is going to help us sort of understand how the computer as a whole works, because the computer as a whole, especially if you're using a graphical based window like what we have here, is all based off of events. When I'm clicking on this window and I'm moving it around, there's different events that are happening. It knows when I'm moving the mouse, it knows what I've clicked, it knows when I'm clicking and dragging, it knows when I'm hovering over things, things are changing. All kinds of events are happening constantly when it comes to using our computer, and then the programs themselves get these events from the operating system in order to actually do what they want to do. So for example, if I click on this window, it changes and there's no events happening over here. There's a few things that won't happen, but a few things will. And if I click over here, it knows where to move all the events. All of this is managed by the operating system, but these events are then sent to our program, and then we can give it the code in order to handle those different things that are happening. All right, so without further ado, one thing that you really want to check out is the link to the Haptic coding site. It's got a really good tutorial. It talks about the mouse variables, mouse pressed variable, and the different kinds of functions that it has. It talks about key pressed and the key and key code, and it gives you some examples. This is a really good example. It shows you some very simple code, what that code actually does, and then you can actually play with the code too and run it and see how it works and get a sense of what's actually going on there. You can look at things like, here's an example of using mouse pressed. So it's using the mouse pressed variable. This is a special variable in processing, and it's changing the color of the background regarding if we press the button or not. This is tracking the mouse and X while we're combining both the mouse and X, mouse Y and mouse X variables with the mouse pressed, so we can create sort of a drawing program. Down here we have this example of looking at different kinds of events like the mouse pressed, released, and dragged. So when we're doing different things, it changes the color of what's actually happening. And we, again, can combine these all together to get different kinds of effects. Really good at sort of developing it in a very simple way. And you can use those as sort of guidance for the activity that you're going to be doing today and what you're working with. It also looks at keyboards, using this idea of the key pressed variable and looking at what keys have been actually pressed, so you can actually see what's being pressed on the actual keyboard specifically, not just that something has been pressed. We can also look at the arrows. That's something we're going to be using for today. And then there's also keyboard input functions like something being typed or multiple keys being happening at the same time. So it covers a lot of the different what ifs, what would I do about all of that stuff, and then there's a really good cheat sheet here that shows how it would work. Okay, so make sure that you read through this and check it out. Definitely where you'd want to start with this lesson, and then you can come back and watch the video. However, at this point, I'm assuming you've gone through it, you've read it, you've tried to understand what's going on. Let's sort of explore it in a little bit more detail. I've taken sort of the liberty of creating a simple program that looks at the different kinds of events. So if I run this code, it just opens up a basic window. And the point of it is just we want to see what actually is happening. So if I go over here and I click on the window, when I click down with the mouse, we can see that as I'm clicking and holding, what we're seeing right now is the mouse pressed that's happening right here. Okay, so it's giving me the mouse X and Y position. So when I press it, because it's within draw is constantly going through here, so it's saying, hey, has the mouse been pressed? Hey, has the mouse been pressed? Hey, has the mouse been pressed? And every time it sees that, it's going to print out its current coordinates. So we can see its X and Y position within the window. If I go outside the window, it still sees it because I've pressed within the window. However, if I'm outside the window and I press, nothing's happening. Something else that you'd see is that it says these things called interrupt events. That's if I click and release, it causes these different events to happen here. Mouse pressed, mouse released. So I can actually see when the mouse has been pressed and when it has been released. You'll notice with the mouse pressed, it only happens once, whereas when I'm pulling, I'm actually constantly looking at this variable. It's happening over and over again because it's within draw. Okay, so if you only want something to happen when they press the button or when they release the button, you would probably want to be using an interrupt or these methods here to be able to do that. If you want something to be happening continuously, looking at using just the variables themselves is a better way of sort of tracking what's going on. Now, switching over to the keyboard, if I press in K, you'll notice that the K pressed and released, same idea. If I press the button, this only happens once I've pressed, and when I release, it only happens once. But when I press and hold, this part here it's constantly checking to see has the key been pressed, has the key been pressed, has the key been pressed. And if it has been pressed, it's going to look at what's the key code and the key. Now, it's a little bit confusing that sometimes you want the key code and sometimes you want the key. Generally, you want, if you're using any kind of letter on the keyboard, you want to be using the key. You'll also know that when I press the key, even if I press it really fast, it happens multiple times. You may not want that. If I press the space bar, you can't really see what's being pressed, but it's actually that there's a space there. If I do enter, okay, you can see that there's a space there because there's an enter key happening. The times when you would want the key code is if you want to use those special buttons like the arrow keys. So if I use the up arrow, you'll notice that the key code has a value, but we have this weird character for key. So if I want the up value, the down value, the left, the right, delete, escape, all of those different ones, we would want to be using the key code in order to be able to pull that off. How do we exactly figure out what all the key codes are? I would say look that up online. You can find all of those things. But it's pretty simple. I'll give you some examples of the arrow keys, and that should at least get you comfortable with looking up what are the different kinds of key codes that we have within the processing. All right, so now that we have sort of a sense of we have these variables that we can use, that we can set it up so that they're constantly being checked, or we have the methods that we can design and use those instead. The methods happen sort of only once, whereas if you use the variables, you can constantly be checking over and over again to see if something's happening. That idea of constantly checking to see if an event has happened, that idea is called pulling. This idea of having it only calling the method once when things happen, that's called an interrupt. So an interrupt means stop everything, do this code, and then go back to what was happening before. So if I press the mouse, it will stop drawing, it will push this out, and then it will keep drawing over and over again. Okay, so it'll immediately jump over, do this code, and then come back, even though we haven't called the method from in here, which is a bit of a weird thing about GUIs and this event-based programming. With interrupts, they just happen. They seem to just happen because they're getting called by the programming via the operating system. All right, so let's build on this a little